Hello quilty friends and welcome back to my channel. My name's Rachel and I make videos about quilting and my creative life. Anywhere that you can find me on the web is listed down in the description box below. And today I'm coming on to share with you not one but two finished quilts. So I'm so glad to have two projects finished and done, me being the one who never finishes projects. And surely that means I deserve some new fabric and to start a new project. What do you think? And in today's video, I'm going to share with you the process of finishing the hand quilting on one, because only one is hand quilted, and also me attaching the bindings. And I'll show you lots of really nice close-up footage of the quilts now that they're both finished. So let's get into the video. So this first quilt that I'm going to show you is a pattern called the Moda Love Charm quilt, and it's actually made using a charm pack. I think I used 2 charm packs to make this because I extended the quilt by adding a large border around the edge. I've used a cotton sateen on the back, which was from Rainbow Fabrics, and I've quilted it using a wave stitch on my sewing machine. I did make a video when I initially made this quilt, the quilt top I think it was. I'll leave the link to that down in the description box below and you can get some more information on the quilt there. I have had this quilt draped over my armchair for maybe about 3-4 months, so I am desperate to get the binding on. I have decided to use leftover jelly roll strips for the binding because I think it will mirror the scrappy look of the quilt quite nicely, and even though they're not the same fabric range, I still think they match the vibe quite well. So all I did was picked out a selection of jelly roll strips. And the second quilt that I'll be finishing today is a pattern by Alice Caroline, and I've made the quilt in a mixture of Liberty Tana lawn and Liberty quilting cotton. The quilting cotton was mainly used for the solid borders around the quilt. So the quilt pattern is called the Sophie Jane quilt, and it was part of the Summer Sew Along Festival, which was a ticketed event, but you can now buy the pattern bundle which was included in that event. So I'll leave the link to that down in the description box below, but at the moment that is the only way to purchase the pattern. So just giving you a close-up. I do need to finish the hand stitching on this quilt. I think I've just got one more row of hand quilting to go all the way around the edge. For the hand quilting of this quilt and the last 2 quilts that I've hand quilted, I've used Gutterman hand quilting thread. It has a slight wax texture to it, so it doesn't tend to get knotted very easily, and it is on the more thinner side in comparison to perlite thread or something like that, but I don't think it's the thinnest type of thread that you can get. I do use quite a long length when I'm hand quilting, and I don't quilt in a hoop. If you would like more information on the process of how I hand quilt without a hoop, or just some more information on how I hand quilted this project, I do have a video on that as well, and I'll leave the link in the description box below so you can check that out. The backing fabric on this quilt is a Liberty Tana lawn as well, and it is so lovely to hand quilt. The needle just goes through the quilt like butter, so that's been really nice. It has took me some time to complete the hand quilting on this project, just because I've picked it up and put it down whenever I fancied working on it, and I think I had finished the quilt top in the summer, so I didn't want to sit beneath the quilt top hand quilting it in the height of the summer, so it has been nice to pick it up now that the winter months have come in. So now that I've finished the hand quilting, let's start the binding on both of these quilts. So here I am just choosing a selection of jelly roll strips, and in terms of how I estimate how much binding I need, because I do only estimate, I just laid the jelly roll strips out and made sure that I had enough to cover all 4 sides of the jelly roll, of the quilt, not the jelly roll. And because I've opted for a scrappy style of binding, I didn't want to have a whole jelly roll strip because that would have been close to covering the whole side of a quilt. I decided to cut some of the longer pieces in half so that I would get more variety throughout the binding. And I didn't measure or anything like that, I just tried to make them a good length. But because don't forget, when you're joining your binding on the diagonal, you do lose quite a bit of length because of doing the diagonal cut, so just bear that in mind. Once I've joined all of my strips and cut off the excess fabric at the back, I just checked that I had enough binding to go around the whole quilt, and to do this I just folded my long strip of binding into 4 and made sure that that covered one of the sides. This is a square quilt, so all the sides are the same size, but if you was doing this on a rectangular quilt, just make sure that that would cover the longest sides. So here you're getting a good view of how short the pieces are. You can go shorter if you wanted to. It's a great way to use up any leftover strips from the quilting project. For the second Liberty quilt, I just echoed a border that was at the beginning of the quilt. This is quite a dark burgundy border, and I thought it would make a really nice binding. So for this one I used 3-inch cuts of fabric rather than 2.5-inch, which people tend to use, and that I'll be using for the jelly rolls. I do find it a little bit tricky to attach binding when it's just 2.5-inch strips. I like a little bit more wiggle room that the 3-inch strips provide. So when I was attaching the binding for this quilt, I decided not to double the binding over. You don't have to double the binding over, and I'm not sure why we even do that. So I just joined it with a 1/4-inch seam, just with the binding regular, not folded in half, if that makes sense. And everything else stays the same in the binding process. You just do the mitered corners in exactly the same way, but this will just give you a little bit more room to make your binding a little bit thicker if that's what you like. If you like a thin binding, then by all means do fold it in half, but I like a fuller binding and to have it slightly wider. And you'll notice here that I don't trim my quilts before attaching the binding, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Once I pass all of the corners, I always just check that the mitered corner has come out correct. So just give it a little bit of a preview and just make sure that it's come out as you would like it to. So let me now show you how I join the ends of the binding together so that it's completely seamless. So I leave myself a good tail on this end, and then I stop stitching way before I get to where I am. So that's probably a good 12 inches because you need a little bit of wiggle room. So I've overestimated my binding by quite a lot. So I'm just going to trim some off. Again, past, that's just excess. So what you need is a piece of fabric that's as wide as your binding is. So I'm going to cut it thin so that we don't get confused on the way round this piece goes. So lay your edges of your binding properly against the quilt. I'm just going to trim this down because I've got the selvage there. So let me get rid of that. So you're going to lay them on top of each other. I haven't got my binding doubled over here. It doesn't make a difference. And then you want to lay this piece on top. So my bottom piece ends just there. So if we just see, my bottom piece is there. You lay this on the top. And then you trim down exactly there. So now we've got an overlap in the fabric that is exactly as wide as your binding. So doing this is a foolproof method because this is 2.5 inch, but I usually prefer a 3 inch. So just so you don't get confused, cut a piece of the binding off and lay it that way, widthways. And that's why I've cut a skinny strip so that you don't get confused, and cut it by however wide you've cut the fabric. It's however wide the binding is. So there we go. Now what we're going to do is pull this over, and then you're just going to join these strips together in the same way that you join your binding strips together. So with the triangle method, which is why you need to leave quite a bit of unsewn space here so that you can pull it all together and have enough room to play with. So you just lay it down on top of each other like so. And then you're just going to stitch diagonally like you would normally. Is that the right way around? I just need to think. No, it's this way. Yeah, so that then when it folds out, it'll be like that. So I'm just going to move it straight to my machine and stitch diagonally. If it makes you more comfortable, please do mark it. I'm going to put my needle back into the middle so that I can get that a little bit more accurate. There we go. That doesn't look like it's in the middle. I do always just eyeball this type of stuff rather than marking it. Now what you want to do, you'll be cutting this triangle off like you do normally, but before you do that, make sure that it fits. So just lay your binding down and you'll see that it just fits perfectly. So now we can trim this off. You can press it at this stage if you want to, but I just make sure that the seams are open when I come to sew over it. So now what you need to do is go back to where you finished off your stitching. Put your quilt underneath. I am running very low on bobbin, my machine says, so I hope I can do this last little bit. Move my needle back to 1/4 inch and stitch right over. So just open that seam when you get to it. And there you go, that will be completely seamless. Oh, I'd run out of bobbin. Well, if that was sewn down, typical, that would just look like any other join in your binding. Let me actually wind the bobbin and I'll show you. Second attempt. So there's our join. And there we go. Absolutely perfect. On the corners. Beautiful corners as well. So when it came to finishing the hand quilted quilt, because I hadn't quilted right up to the edge of the quilt top, I decided to do what's called a lap of honour or a lap of victory, which is where you use your sewing machine to go right around to the edge of the quilt, about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge, just to secure all of the layers together. I didn't do this on the other one because I'd machine quilted right to the edge, so there was no danger of my quilt shifting right in those last little corners and things. So this one I decided to go all the way around to the edge just with a straight stitch, and if you have a walking foot, that's really going to help you with this process and also when you're attaching the binding. This one I had folded the binding in half. I decided to revert to my original process. The binding is folded in half, and again the quilt isn't trimmed. I attached the quilt binding with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and again the walking foot is on. Once I've attached the binding, I'll then use a pair of scissors to trim away the excess batting and backing of the quilt top. The reason why I do this is because, like I said, I like my binding to be full, and I also like it to be wide. And what I do is I just trim a little bit off, maybe about 1/2 an inch away from that seam from joining the binding. And I just check at this point that the binding folds over. I like how full it is, it's not too full, and then if that is to my satisfaction, I go ahead and trim the rest of the quilt. I do save all of the bits of fabric from around the edge. This one was particularly wide, but the other 3 sides was quite a short side. But I just store them away with my Liberty. I have 2 boxes of Liberty, one for small pieces that maybe will fit a hexagon on it or small bits of patchwork, and then I have a box where I've got larger pieces, but they still are small pieces in comparison to fat quarters or anything, and I just store those away appropriately. Now obviously this trimming process, you're not squaring the quilt up, so if that is something that you like to do, then by all means trim before you attach the binding. But for me, squaring the quilt up isn't something that's a concern, and also it would just be a big pain getting a big cutting mat out and trying to wrangle with the quilt. I much prefer just trimming it by hand. And then once that is all done, I then use binding clips to fold all of my binding back, ready for hand stitching down. For a quilt this size, I'll generally clip the whole one side of the quilt and then stitch that, and once it's stitched down, I'll then clip the other side of the quilt and just work my way around like that. When it comes to the mitered corner, sometimes I find it easier to get the binding around the corner if you trim a little bit of the quilt backing and the wadding away. You don't trim away any of the binding fabric. You just want to take away enough that you can get the binding around and form that nice right angle on the inner corner of the quilt. Again, I just put a clip right in the corner, and when I come to sewing it, I can just adjust it as I need to make sure I'm covering up those seams. When hand sewing my binding at the back, where possible, I try and colour match the thread. Even though you don't see much of the stitching when you use an applique stitch, you can sometimes see a little bit. So I just colour match to the closest possible, and I do like to use a polyester thread. Just use whatever thread you prefer. We shan't get into the debate on polyester versus cotton thread. I have recently bought these leather thimbles from Amazon. I usually use the Clover leather thimble, but I find that it wears out quite quickly and they are quite expensive. They only last around a month before you get a hole through them. So I bought these on Amazon. They were £5 or £6 for 10. Now they're an assorted size, so not all of them fit my middle finger, but even so it's still good value, and they are actually long thimbles, so they would come down to your first knuckle, but I just trim them down and you've got a little bit of excess leather that you can use there to make your own thimble if you wanted to. But I'm finding that they've worked really well. I've now bound 2 quilts, done endless amounts of English paper piecing, and it doesn't even have a hole in it. So if you also like a leather thimble and you find this to be an issue, I'll leave a link in the description box to where I purchased these on Amazon and you can give them a try for yourself. When I was folding back the binding on the other quilt, it was a slightly different technique because if you remember, it's not folded in half. So what I did is I folded the raw edge to the raw edge of the quilt top and then folded it down so that you was then doubling it over at that point. And I did the same thing. I clipped the whole one side of the quilt before moving to the next side and sewing it up. And this actually formed a wider binding than using the 3-inch cut, so I might be tempted to use this again in the future and use any leftover jelly roll strips as well to make my binding. I do absolutely love the process of hand stitching the binding down to the back. I just find it such a relaxing process. You get to sit underneath your quilt and just enjoy all of the work that you've done. Because I'd pretty much been using this quilt, I decided to put it in the wash as soon as it was bound. So this is the crinkly effect of the quilting once I had washed it. And I really like how the binding came out. I did cut off the points on my border, but that isn't something that bothers me on a quilt like this. I do usually tend to opt for a backing fabric that's got quite a big pattern on it because it then hides the join of your fabric. But I'm thinking on my next few quilts I might try and use a plainer backing so that you can see the hand quilting on the back. That's the join just there, but from a distance you can't even see it, and you'll see it's the same for the Liberty quilt as well. The Liberty quilt hasn't yet been washed, but you can see it has a wonderfully crinkly effect because of the hand quilting, and I really like how the binding mirrors that darker border on the inside of the quilt. So I really hope that you've enjoyed watching me finish these 2 quilts. It feels really good to get them both finished and ticked off my list. So until the next time I see you, I hope you get some nice stitching time and take care of yourself. Bye bye.